I'm Jeanette Kane from Jewelry Arts Inc. And in this video, I'm going to show you the fastest and easiest way to solder a bezel down. There's a lot of different ways to do things, but my ways work way better and faster. Let's be honest. I'll show you. I'm going to be soldering down a 22 karat bezel to a 20 karat backsheet. So I'm going to use 20 karat soft solder. You know, whenever you're working in gold, you have to use the same carat or lower. So in other words, you couldn't use 22 karat solder on a 20 karat backsheet because the melting point would be higher and you might have a problem with your metal melting, which you don't want that. So I like to use squares. I think they're sort of like the most efficient form for solder because normally I cut them into little bits and I ball them up. The little balls are a lot better at sort of staying in contact with your seam. So I feel like those little squares, they get in the flux, you know, and they kind of shimmy around. And have you ever had that experience? You're soldering a bezel down and the solder melts, but it just leaves those little puddles in there and it doesn't fill in. It's a lot more common using squares than using the balls. So I'll show you how to ball up your solder and how to put them in there. Oh my God. Please sing along. It's my favorite. Stop. I love having like the real studio in the videos. I really do. Just never say anything that can't be on the internet. I'm gonna cut up my solder. I use my Joyce Chens because, you know, these are really sharp and cut everything beautifully. They're like my favorite thing. And if you ever have any trouble cutting your solder, like it hops all over the table, basically do it like this. I cut a little fringe, you know, like a little eyelash, and then I turn it, and I just put my finger up against the edge. And then I cut, make sure that the scissors are clearing your finger or you won't like that very much. And that way, you see what I mean? My solder is right here and it didn't fly away. You can lose a lot of solder that way. Okay, so I'm gonna ball it up. Now, when you ball up your solder, you wanna do it hot and fast because if you do it slowly, it'll get oxidized, which is not great. And if you go really slowly, if you've ever had this experience, it basically will look like beef jerky. It looks like it gets all dehydrated looking and shriveled and very unhappy. If that ever happens to your solder, just put it in your sweeps and cut new pieces and ball it up because a lot of times it won't flow at all once it's gotten to that sort of really unhappy, shriveled up state. Okay, so I'm gonna turn my flame up. I've got my solder balls right here and I'm gonna go in for the kill just like that, really quick. So here's my little solder balls and you see how they didn't even really oxidize that much because I did it so fast. So that's kind of what you're looking for. And you see how, you know, the balls are relatively smooth looking, you know, they're not all like shrivelly and weird looking. So what I've done up here, just to show you, is here's my bezel, which I fused shut and, you know, rounded it out and filed it and sanded top and bottom and double checked that it fit my stone all pretty. I've got my back sheet, which I flattened, and I've got them laying on top of each other. Normally when I'm soldering something to a back sheet, I normally do it from underneath on a tripod like this, because that way I can heat from right underneath here and the solder really flows well underneath. You know, you can certainly heat from the top if you're really careful, but what usually happens, unless you have like a lot of experience with the torch, if you're heating from above, what happens is solder goes toward the most heat. So then it kind of tends to climb up the bezel. So if that's ever happened to you before, that's because of the direction of your heat. So that's why I like to heat from underneath. I feel like you get a better result. So I do everything with my soldering tweezers because I can move things, I can poke things, I can pick things up. They have the little serrations on the inside so my little solder balls don't go flying everywhere. So this is pretty much my essential tool for doing this. So normally what I do, now that I've got my little balls, I just take them and I'm gonna dip them in a little paste flux. And I've already added water to my paste flux so it's a little soupy in there. You don't want it to get so dry that you can't get your solder off of your tweezers because that's very irritating. So I just take it after I've dipped in a little flux, I'm gonna put it on the inside. One of the central themes of the way that I solder is that I'm always doing whatever I can to minimize my cleanup. So for something like this, I'm definitely gonna put my solder on the inside so that I have less cleanup on the outside once I trim away the excess bezel. Now, I don't know about you guys, but like I drink a lot of coffee. So if you'll notice, whenever I'm like picking something up or placing it, I'm usually first resting my wrist or my arm or something against the table and creating like a little bit of support, because like I drink a buttload of coffee and like it gets a little shaky. So it's actually not usually about having like this perfect hand control of like a surgeon. It's just about bracing yourself so that whatever tremor you have is kind of kept somewhat controlled. So judging by the size of the balls that I've made, I think probably 4 pieces should be plenty, but I'll flow it and I can always add more if I want to. You know, you get better and better the more you do this at estimating how much solder it's going to take. Because normally you sort of want like just enough and to overfill it a hair so that when you clean it up, it's just, you know, nice and spiffy. Because in case you guys haven't figured out yet, my least favorite thing to do in the entire world is like filing and sanding and that cleaning up stuff. So I'm always thinking of like, how do I do it as clean as possible? Okay, so I'm gonna add maybe a little tiny dab of paste flux on the outside, just to make sure that it's all around the seam. You always wanna make sure where you want the solder to go has flux. Paste flux is pretty concentrated, so you notice I haven't like put like a giant coat of it on there. This is plenty to keep this clean and solder it. I'll show you a little close-up of what it looks like, and then we'll solder. So you see, I just put the 4 pieces in there, the little paste flux. Now, as long as those pieces of solder are up against the bezel, I don't really care where they end up. Because honestly, when I start drying this, I'm sure they're gonna move around. But to get the seam to fill really just requires like paste flux and a really nice hot torch. So, you know, if a few of them roll right next to each other, I won't bother to fix it. I'll only move them if they roll sort of toward the interior where they're not making good contact anymore. So first I'm going to sort of just gently dry my flux, and like I said, just make sure my solder balls are up against my bezel somewhere. And then I'm going to take my nice big fat #1 tip and I'm going to heat from underneath. And I want you to really watch how little my flame moves. Most people are like, you know what I mean, like so. Basically, every time you move the flame, it just lets the heat dissipate. What you want to do is put it where you want it, let the piece get hot, and let that solder flow like quick, because this is going to happen fast. And I know that's contrary to a lot of the soldering advice that's out there, but that's just wrong. So let me show you how fast it can be. Okay, so I'm going to dry it gently, and I've got my tweezers right here in case anything moves. And if you dry gently enough, the solder will stay in place, but like don't get too freaked out. I mean, solder will move around. The flux is wet. When it dries, things hop. So for me, because I'm right-handed, I like to keep the tweezers in my right hand and the torch in my left, because that way I can really do everything I need to do. So now that's relatively dry. They're not wiggling around. So I'm gonna go to it. Also, if you've ever fallen victim to the whole, oh, the cone is the hottest part of the torch, like, well, that may be true, but that's not the part of the torch that you want underneath your piece when you're getting it hot. You want to have it out at the end right here. I mean, enough that you're like really on the piece, but that's where all your heat is going. And then as soon as you see it flow, I'm going to pull this flame right out of there real quick. So be prepared. Okay, put it right underneath like that. Just going to hold it steady and watch what happens. Oh, that's done. If your solder isn't going fast like that, more than likely you just don't have enough heat. Now, granted, don't get me wrong, if you've got like a great big piece, it might take a little longer than that. But usually what that means too is that maybe you want to move up to an even bigger torch. I find that, I mean, this is an approximate thing, but if you're heating for longer than about 20 seconds, you should have gone with a bigger tip. You know what I mean? You should have gone with more heat. So, because you see how that flowed all the way around? I mean, I always throw it in the pickle and then check it just to make sure there's not like a little pinhole somewhere, but you can see that that's all filled in. I'll give you a little close-up of this after it's pickled, but that's it. You know, it's getting everything set up and in the right spot and all that kind of stuff that takes the time. The actual soldering should be really quick. So here's the macro view. So you see how it filled in very beautifully. I'll spin it around so you can see all the sides, but this method is just, it's the easiest, it's the fastest, it works beautifully. So got it down to a science at this point. See what I mean? And you see how there's just a tiny bit of overfill. That little bit of overfill is what lets you clean up and not have any like little like pits or a little depression there. You always want just a tiny bit more, like so. So you see what I mean? This is all we want out of life when we solder a bezel down. So if you start soldering your bezels like I do, you will be very happy. That's all for now.